All right, we are back and we will continue reviewing the video, The Moral Argument. Can we be good without God? Let's get into it. Don't have anything set up. Okay, no, I have it mostly set up already. And I don't see anybody. Oh, okay, cool. People in the comments already. Great. And I'll get to all you in a bit. Let's just get started on the video.
I found this very hard to believe at first, but many people claim that moral truths are simply brute facts about the universe. Basically, they claim just based on one's opinion. It doesn't actually have any bearing on whether or not something is good or bad. However, the thing is, even though for the longest time atheists have agreed with us that if God doesn't exist, objective morality can't exist, many modern atheists actually believe in objective morality. So what exactly is their foundation for this objective morality? Well, I found this very hard to believe at first, but many people claim that moral truths are simply brute facts about the universe. Basically, they claim that truths like it's wrong to torture people for fun, these are simply fixed aspects of the universe. In the same way that mathematical and logical truths are fixed aspects of the universe, so too are moral truths. In the same way that 2 + 2 = 4 is simply true, so too are moral truths simply true. To quote W.S. Morriston in his article, God and the Ontological Foundation for Morality, why are love and justice and generosity and kindness and faithfulness good? What is there in the depths of reality to make them good? My preferred answer is nothing further. If you like, you may say that they are the ultimate standard of goodness. What makes them the standard? Nothing further. Possessing these characteristics just is good making, full stop. Now, for me, this claim isn't exactly very satisfactory, and the reason for it is because this explanation for the foundation of morality is effectively a non-answer. It's the same sort of response that a tired parent might tell their child if their kid asks them, "But mom, why is it bad that I pushed that kid over and stole his toy?" And of course, the parent would respond with, "Because it's just bad." In short, this explanation, as much as some philosophers do like it, it's basically just an assertion and an assumption that these moral claims are simply true, and it's an assumption that's made without explanation. Some philosophers might state that things like genocide and torture are bad in their essence, whereas love and generosity are good in their essence. And yet without God, it's very difficult to explain where this bad or good essence actually comes from.
All right, I'm going to have a look at what he's saying in here. He includes these like extra comments in the text. I'm not satisfied by this either. That's not in and of itself a good reason to agree or disagree with the view. I mean, it's a reason enough for me to not accept the view. That doesn't make it any sort of publicly valuable reason why anyone should care if I don't accept the view. Because, of course, you could present a really good argument for something or a very good rationale for something, and someone could, in principle, say, I'm not satisfied. I'm not convinced. That's not good enough. And I don't think any of the rest of us would necessarily feel obliged to care if someone had that sort of reaction. And so while I'm very sympathetic to what he's saying here, I'm not satisfied by this either. That by itself doesn't have much dialectical force. Yeah, okay, so you're not satisfied. Neither am I. So I actually share the dissatisfaction here. That's not gonna do anything to convince someone that thinks otherwise, though. Not that he's suggesting that it would. This does run into a deeper issue in philosophy, which is that if someone does just say, look, I just have the intuition that such and such is true, or I just take this to be a brute fact, or I just think this is some primitive notion or something like that, there may be sort of bedrock disagreements for which I don't know of any available methods, at least with the resources available to analytic philosophers, to resolve those sorts of disagreements. Now, I take that to be an issue with analytic philosophy, because I do think issues could be resolved using other methods than armchair appeals to one's intuitions. But hey, philosophers do this, and these are the methods that they stick themselves with, and I think that they're a bit too narrow. And I don't think that all the intuition mongering works in the first place, much less that it could resolve these sort of bedrock disagreements. All right. Got people in the chat. We got Deus Nilo. You get 1,000 Lance loot. We got Cody here. Yeah. And welcome back. You get 500 and Igor gets 250. Sully quotes, I am unsatisfied. Yeah. I mean, I'm not too moved by someone saying they're not satisfied, but I do share that dissatisfaction in this case. So Sully says, thinking moral truths are fundamental doesn't automatically mean you don't have a justification for thinking they are. Yeah. And so it's possible that you could say, that the moral facts are primitive or properly basic or unanalyzable or self-evident, or, one is directly acquainted with them, or any of a variety of ways in which one might say that there's no further appeal, there's no further account that one can give of why one holds that particular view or what their metaphysical status is or something like that. But one could nevertheless think that one is justified in employing the sorts of epistemic practices that would lead one to having these sort of, this belief in brute facts. So one might say, hey, our intuitions are generally reliable, and I have an intuition that some particular thing is wrong, and it would appear that it stands independently wrong to me, and there is no further metaphysical grounding that intuition needs. I have an intuition, it seems wrong, and I'm justified in believing it's wrong unless there are defeaters. So that would be something like Hume's phenomenal conservatism. On that view, you are justified in believing in these sorts of brute facts, if that is in fact what the realist believes in those particular cases. Now, I don't accept that, both because I don't endorse phenomenal conservatism and I don't endorse this intuition-based approach to arriving at conclusions, especially about these kinds of a priori truths that are supposed to be robust and substantive, and they're not just tautologies. So I don't think any of that works, but there certainly are secular atheists that, secular accounts of moral realism from atheists that purport not only to maintain that there are these sort of brute moral facts, but that one is justified in believing in them. He seems here to be assuming that the people that hold these positions have no justification for their views. And perhaps they don't, but it's not for lack of trying. It's not like they just, when they're saying there's nothing further to be said, or they're not like further grounded in something more fundamental, it's not like they're saying that they don't have justification for believing that there are facts of this kind. So if he is taking people that hold these views to themselves be claiming that they have no justification for these beliefs, that wouldn't be true. It's not clear, though. Let's have a look at the quote. What I'm trying to say here is that it is difficult to justify how these are objectively good or bad in their essence without simply appealing to one's own preconceived notions of what makes something good or bad. I'm not really sure what he's saying there. So if you're an ethical intuitionist, you're without appealing to preconceived notions of what makes something good or bad. I don't know what he means by that. So, this is a rare case where I think that the criticism is unclear and not particularly good, and is not really raising any sort of serious problem, even for views that I consider like the most objectionable, like ethical intuitionism and non-naturalist realism. I don't think he's raising a clear objection here, if that's what he's trying to do. Yeah, so David says I suppose one could bite the bullet, endorse an infinite regress. I don't know what that's in. Okay, let me see. David says, the usual refrain is that explanations have to end somewhere, since it's not feasible for there to be an infinite explanatory regress. I don't know why there couldn't be. Maybe there just is. And David says, although technically I suppose one could bite the bullet and endorse an infinite regress. Right, yeah. So I don't have a huge problem with saying that there could be an infinite regress of possible explanations, but I don't have a problem with cutting off inquiry somewhere because I'm a pragmatist. And, that I don't have this view that one has to have all these deep explanations that span infinity and are trying to grasp these deep and fundamental truths that aren't ultimately for use. All right. All right. Looking at the comments. All right, let's keep going.
None of the obvious follow-up questions you might ask regarding this can actually be answered by the idea that some things just are good or bad. Another issue with the idea that moral truths are simply true in the same way that mathematical and logical truths are simply true is that moral truths aren't actually analogous to mathematical and logical truths. Logical truths and mathematical truths describe how things are. They describe how things actually work. For example, 2 + 2 = 4 just describes how things are. If you have 2 of one thing and add another 2, that by definition just is 4. Similarly, with logical truths, the idea that if A equals B, B must equal A is just how things are. And if A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C, just describes how things work. And the problem with trying to compare moral truths to these truths is that moral truths don't describe how things work. Claims like you shouldn't lie, cheat, and steal don't describe how things work because people do that all the time. Rather, moral truths describe how things should be. And not only that, they describe how things should be between persons. Because after all, we are morally obligated to one another. We are morally obligated to other people. You're not morally obligated to an object or to some other sort of abstract law. You are, at the end of the day, obligated to other people. Morality, at the end of the day, is all about interpersonal relationships and behaviors. And so if transcendent objective moral truths exist, that seems to very strongly imply there's a transcendent person we are obligated to.
Why? What?
Today is all about interpersonal relationships and behaviors. And so if transcendent objective moral truths exist, that seems to very strongly imply there's a transcendent person we are obligated to.
I see. Okay, I see the reasoning there. I wanted to comment on this first. Here he's saying that mathematical and logical truths are unlike moral truths, and then he points to a difference between them. So mathematical and logical truths on this view are descriptive, and moral truths are not. They're normative. Okay, that is a difference. Why is that relevant? So if someone says if someone says logic, mathematics, and morality are all similar in that the fundamental truths within their respective domains are brute facts, that they are in some way primitive or basic or unanalyzable, or there's no further explanation or basis for them. They're not grounded in anything. There's lots of language people use to say these sorts of things. And some of those are going to be different from one another, but let's just say that they're all supposed to be these sort of brute facts, because that's the terminology used. They're all brute facts. There's brute facts about mathematics, there's brute facts about logic, and there's brute facts about morality. To say, okay, but they're different, the math and logic are descriptive and morality is prescriptive or normative. Okay, that's true. They're different in that respect. Why does that mean that they can't all be brute facts? So someone could just think, yeah, there's brute facts about what's descriptively the case, and there's brute facts about what's normatively the case. Simply because you pointed to a difference between two things does not mean that because there's a difference, therefore the way in which they are being compared is somehow illegitimate. This is something that I talked about in one of my recent blog posts, where I call this the over-comparison fallacy. So what I say in the blog post is I say, imagine that I compare a lemon and the sun. And because people get nitpicky and say the sun's not technically yellow, but let's say we pick a yellow dwarf star of some kind, somewhere in the cosmos. And I say, okay, this lemon is yellow and this star is yellow. And I'm just comparing them with respect to their color. Now, if I were to say lemons and stars are both yellow, or at least some stars are yellow, some people are going to object and say, you can't compare lemons and stars. And if I said, okay, why is that? They would say, you can't compare them because stars are much bigger than a lemon, and they're full of plasma, and they're really hot, and they have a strong gravitational influence, and they have planets orbiting them, and planets don't orbit lemons, and lemons aren't really hot, and lemons they're super massive, and they're not really bright. Yeah, that's all true. Lemons and stars are very different in many, many respects, but they're also similar in that in some cases there are yellow lemons and yellow stars. So when you're comparing them in terms of their color. You're not comparing them along other dimensions. So the over comparison fallacy occurs when you say that some sort of comparison is illegitimate because the two things in question are different in some other way, like they fail to be the same in some way that wasn't relevant to the relevant comparison. If I compare two people and say that they're both named Steve, it'd be a little silly to say you can't compare Steve and Steve because one Steve is my husband and the other Steve is not. You can't compare them. Yes, you can compare them. In fact, comparisons require there to be differences. What are you going to do? Compare something to something that's identical to it? Then it would be the same thing. What the hell would that even mean? So people will say stuff like this. In fact, this has even become this like expression people use. They'll say, you can't compare apples to oranges. Now, some people will say, one second. Some people will say that's like comparing apples to oranges. And sometimes people will mean something like you're comparing things that are like too different. Maybe there's some legitimate way to use that sort of phrase. But the notion that you can't compare two things because they're different or because they're too different is ridiculous. Now, if I were to try to compare two things that were different along the relevant dimension of comparison, that would be a bit silly, you know? So it would make sense if I were to say that this apple over here, and I point to a red apple, is yellow like the sun. Uh, you might say that's an inappropriate comparison because they're not both yellow. But people will just point to things that are different in a bunch of ways, and someone's pointing to a way in which they're similar, and they'll say you can't compare them. Why? Because they're too different. What the hell? Of course you can compare things that are very different in other respects. So that's a goofy idea. Again, that's not to say there aren't instances in which people say that's like comparing apples to oranges, where they're just indicating that there's some sort of comparison that is in some other respect inappropriate. But in this case, he simply pointed to a difference. Pointing to a difference doesn't show that the difference is relevant to whatever the original comparison was supposed to be. So I don't know what point he's trying to make here. It's not very clear what the objection is, that these things are different, therefore you can't analogize them. Why not? Why not? Oh, right. Sully says, yeah, this is some Craig stuff. He thinks moral authority can be granted in a person because morality is personal in some important way. And then the person has to be transcendent because the facts are transcendent, therefore God. Yeah. So
interpersonal relationships and behaviors related to an object or to some other sort of abstract law, you are at the end of the day obligated to other people.
So the idea here is something like, look, morality has to do with these like interpersonal relations that we have with one another, and that fundamentally morality is about how we treat other people, what our relationships are with other people. There's something kind of interpersonal about it. And so it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense to say that uh, moral facts aren't in some way made true by or dependent on a personal being. I don't see why not. So you could there why couldn't there be some impersonal force that makes it the case that there are these stance independent moral facts, and then all of those stance independent moral facts concern the relationships between agents, between beings interacting with one another? Why would the force itself have to be a transcendent sorry, not just transcendent, but a personal force? So you know, I'm trying to think of a comparison. Like I don't know. If I think of a comparison, I'll let you know. But I don't see any particularly good reason to think that if the sort of first order moral facts, like the content of the normative moral facts, all are facts about how you should treat other people, that whatever it is that makes those facts true must itself be an entity or a person. So just because a body of facts concerns social relations doesn't mean that whatever has made it the case that those facts concern social relations must itself be some sort of entity capable of entering into social relations. Why would that follow? Why? Again, it's just like, hey, this is social, so the source has to be social. Why? Is that like that's not a logical principle. Like, what is there a contradiction if it's not? If not, what is the idea here? I don't even know why it would imply that. That seems quite strange to me, to just say, hey, this is social, so its source has to be social. Why? Okay, I'm repeating the same point. It's very puzzling. What's puzzling about this is that there's this claim made that like it's this thing implies that thing based on what? What? Like, there's no explanation given. Is this an intuition that he has? Because I don't have that intuition. That sounds totally baffling and bizarre to me. What is this based on?
Morality, at the end of the day, is all about interpersonal relationships and behaviors. And so if transcendent objective moral truths exist, that seems to very strongly imply there's a transcendent person we are obligated to.
Why? I'd love to know why. I haven't heard any explanation for why this would be true. Let's have a look at the chat. Still, he's saying a whole lot. Yeah, so Sully says this is some Craig stuff. He thinks that authority can only be grounded in a person because morality is personal in some important way. And then the person has to be transcendent because the facts are transcendent, therefore God. That's very strange. It just sounds strange to me. I don't know why I would think that was true. All right. Sully says the reason Craig gives is that he thinks duties can only be to a person, if I recall correctly. Okay. So a realist could just be a realist and say that there's normative facts, but that they're not duties to people. Like it would be pretty easy for a normative, like a moral realist, to get around this. They could say that there's facts about what's morally good or bad and what we should or shouldn't do, but they're not like duties per se. I don't know. I'm not a realist, but I would wonder what he means by duty. Like, is this supposed to be some sort of analytic claim that duties just have to be to other people? Because one, I think an obvious response from a secular realist is no, they don't. Like, it doesn't seem like to me like it's part of the concept. So again, I don't want to play defense for non-naturalist realists too hard, but it doesn't seem to me like duties have to be to people. Why would they have to be to people? But even if one construes duty in some interpersonal or social sense, and that they would have to be to people, which I'm fine with. I'm fine with saying there is a concept of duty which requires some sort of social relation. You have to have a duty too. I'm fine with someone saying that's the only way that they could think about duties. Okay. Then the secular realist would just say that I don't think there's duties of that kind. I think there's some other kind of duty. Now, if you say, okay, well, that's conceptually weird or there's problems to that, fine. I already have problems with the realist. If you want to add another one to the list, I don't have a huge problem with that. But like, it's not like they're not going to have a response to this or not have some way of addressing this. And I would like to see some engagement with that. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, not so fast. There is one last atheistic explanation for objective morality. You see, some claim that the foundation for morality comes from our shared moral intuitions that we develop. Well, not so fast. There is years. And so if transcendent objective moral truths exist, that seems to very strongly imply there's a transcendent person we are obligated to. Well, not so fast. There is one last atheistic explanation for objective morality.
Yeah, so he hasn't really given much in the way of there's like naturalist accounts of realism. There's non-naturalist accounts of realism. There's different non-naturalists. There's Mike Humer. There's David Enoch. There's Scanlon. There's Parfit. He's implying that there's just a few. Like there's a whole bunch of them. What is he talking about? And there's quite a few arguments that different philosophers give. Again, secular accounts for moral realism. You have Humer's ontological argument and Humer's argument for moral convergence. You have Enoch's deliberative indispensability. You have Cuneo's companions in guilt. You have quite a few arguments that are both for moral realism and against moral anti-realism. And he hasn't addressed any of these. And these are all secular arguments. Even when the proponent of the argument is Christian, I think Terence Cuneo is a Christian. That doesn't mean you can't give arguments that don't require God's existence or appeal to God's existence to make a case for moral realism. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, and I mean that quite literally, that I don't think any of these arguments are good, but it's not like he's addressed and brought up these arguments and offered objections to them. So it's a little weird to present a case against secular, or you could say atheist conceptions of moral realism and not mention or address any of these arguments. This is, if you want to argue against atheistic or secular conceptions of realism, it really shouldn't be atheistic. It should be secular. All it requires is that they don't in some way require or depend on the existence of God. Even Christians or theists could appeal to many of these arguments. So atheistic is a bit of a misnomer. It's not the best way to describe these kinds of arguments. In any case, I would want to see some engagement with these secular arguments, and I'm not seeing any acknowledgement of even their existence, much less engagement with them. But yeah, this whole stuff about like duties require, like laws require a lawgiver, duties require somebody that we have the duty to. Like, what kind of claims are these? This is some kind of analytic claim. Realists are just going to reject that. So like non-naturalist secular realists are just going to reject that. And if you want to scoff at that and say that, that doesn't make sense, or that's really implausible, or that's not the proper analysis of whatever it is that you're analyzing, whatever concept it might be, a concept of a duty, those secular realists, it's not like once you start fleshing out your theology, they're not going to make similar points about the Trinity or some other theological concept you have. There's going to be push and pull on both ends. It's not at all clear that theism is going to come out on top as offering some sort of more streamlined and easier way to arrive at a non-naturalist realist account than an atheist or a secular proponent of non-naturalist realism. It's just not at all obvious theism has some sort of significant advantage here, all things considered. And I don't see a whole lot from theists explaining why they have some advantage when it comes to accounting for realism.
You see, some claim that the foundation for morality comes from our shared moral intuitions that we developed via evolution. So basically, morality is a biological fact because all of us have the same common ancestor and therefore evolved the exact same moral intuitions. The main idea behind
It's
this
a gross oversimplification. I don't know of anybody that thinks that we all evolved to have exactly the same moral intuitions.
claim is basically we evolved altruistic moral behaviors. So like loving behaviors or self-sacrificial behaviors. We evolved these sort of behaviors because these behaviors, counterintuitive as it may seem, can actually increase your fitness in a given environment. Because by being altruistic to your close relatives, this would increase the survivability of those close relatives. And because those relatives share many of your genes, it means that by being altruistic to those relatives, they are more likely to survive and reproduce, passing your genes on indirectly. And therefore, altruism would actually make you more fit in a given environment. And therefore, evolution by means of natural selection would actually select for altruistic behaviors. Altruism may have also evolved because by doing good for others, others could return the favor. If you provided food to someone when they were down on their luck, they might do the same for you when you're down on your luck. And that would increase your survivability and reproduction, which is what evolution at the end of the day ultimately cares about. And therefore,
Prevalent in a population, which can lead to overall evolution of a species. For example, a population of bacteria may evolve antibiotic resistance over time, as the bacteria without such resistance will die off. Okay, he's just given a general description. Not very interesting.
Because our evolution can explain these moral intuitions we have, that would mean that we have a basis for objective morality, because biology transcends culture. And because all of us are human at the end of the day, that would mean we have an objective basis. Now, some might want to object to this by saying that we don't know if this evolutionary story is actually true.
Yeah, I mean, who makes this argument specifically? So there are ethical intuitionists, but I don't know of many of them that are going to directly appeal to our having some sort of shared evolutionary history. If anything, our having a shared evolved moral psychology is typically taken to potentially be a substantial threat to moral realism. I mean, this is the whole point of evolutionary debunking arguments. So who exactly is making these sorts of arguments? You know, he's not providing sources for this one. So it's not to say there aren't people presenting arguments like this, but I don't take ethical intuitionists to typically be appealing to our shared evolutionary history. They are typically appealing to some sort of shared faculty for reasoning. And that faculty of reasoning is not specifically couched in or functioning in terms of its capacity for directly enhancing our reproductive fitness. So I'm not really sure why he's presenting this type of argument specifically. Maybe this is something he's heard from atheists or something. It wouldn't surprise me if some random atheist at some atheist meeting or something presented an argument like this. But I would have hoped that there would be greater engagement with the kinds of arguments that secular moral realists provide, which I don't know of any of them that would present an argument quite like this.
However, I actually want to take a very different approach to this. I want to show you that even if we assume all of this is true, that we evolved over millions of years to have our moral intuitions, that doesn't actually give us a basis for objective morality. So for the rest of this presentation, assume that this story is true. Now, why is it that even if this is true, it can't provide us a basis for objective morality? Well, the reason evolution can't give us a basis for objective morality is because of the context in which altruism would have evolved. Altruism would have evolved when we were organized into very small groups made up almost entirely of our own extended family. This would mean that everyone who we would be altruistic towards would effectively be related to us. And therefore, by being altruistic towards them, that would increase our fitness indirectly. And this is because, of course, our relatives share our genes. And if that is the case, then this evolutionary explanation for morality doesn't actually give us any reason to believe we should be altruistic towards those outside of our immediate family. Because after all, doing that was never the purpose of altruism. It was all about helping your own family. And so there's no reason to actually be good towards those outside of your family if this explanation is true. Behaviors like giving to a charity or risking your life to save someone you don't know, these sorts of behaviors could only make sense under our evolutionary model if we assumed they were evolutionary flukes. Let me explain using...
I don't think that that's true. So, you could say that we have an innate predisposition to have some sort of partiality towards conspecifics or members of our a particular in-group or members of our family or some other sort of specifiable group. It doesn't have to be the kin groups. So, okay, so over the course of human evolutionary history, we mostly lived in small kin groups as far as the available evidence is concerned. We weren't living in these like large scale societies where lots of people around you weren't your family members. That's true. He's right about that. Now, one might then hypothesize that to the extent that we evolved an altruistic predisposition within those family groups that we lived in, that it would be this very strong tendency to favor only our close kin and to be indifferent to or potentially hostile towards outsiders. And then when we go out in the world today, we observe many instances in which people are highly altruistic towards people that are not their kin and that they are absolutely sure are not their kin, or at least don't believe are their kin, which is all you'd really need. They wouldn't have to be right. And so people are altruistic towards non-family members. And then the idea might be that, evolution can't explain this. Evolution can explain this, and it can explain this very easily. Evolution, insofar as it influences human behavior or the behavior of animals more generally, does not require a sort of direct wiring of a particular behavioral tendency. Rather, evolution can shape certain sorts of faculties or capacities. I mean, there are other potential explanations here too. Actually, I'll give a quick one. It could be that if we evolved in close in groups where they were mostly kin, that you could just have genes that promote behavior that say, be nice to the people around you. And so then if you're around people that are not your close family members, you would still have a predisposition to be nice to those people. And so the way that genes can code behavior, it doesn't have to be specifically, it's not like it has to be only care about family members, do not care about non-family members. You don't have to have natural selection select for genes that would prompt behavior like that. So, the whole idea that we would only care about family members and couldn't, be concerned altruistically for non-family members, if morality were a product of evolution, it's highly questionable. It's unclear why genes would only be able to do one or not the other. Maybe it'd be more probable that they would do one but not the other. It's not clear that that's true. But the other thing that genes can do is they could shape various sorts of learning faculties. So you could have something like this. It could be that people evolved to go through a long developmental period in which they acquire the norms and standards of their culture. So they have these various sorts of learning faculties, and various aspects of this are going to be, the psychology involved may be shaped by and biologically prepared for certain sorts of judgments, attitudes, and dispositions. It could be that people are more disposed to develop, maintain, and act on certain sorts of moral dispositions than others. So, it might be pretty easy to get people to moralize vengeance, and it might be quite difficult to get people to moralize wearing purple hats. Okay, so that might be the case. And it could be that evolution is pushing us or has shaped our psychology in ways that make us more inclined to adopt certain moral perspectives rather than others. But it can also be the case, and this very likely is the case to at least some extent, that our values, attitudes, dispositions, the behavioral repertoire that we end up exhibiting as adults is heavily dependent on our culture, and that really, to a significant extent, human minds enter into the world and say, okay, well, what are the rules for my society? And then you pick up those rules, and those rules can differ from one society to another, and people then act on those rules. And so we could be enculturated into a society that promotes altruism towards people that are not close kin, or even towards non-human animals. And so long as we have the kinds of learning faculties or cognitive faculties that allow us to flexibly adapt, modify, or change our attitudes, our dispositions, our values, and our behavioral tendencies over the course of our lives, people can come to adopt attitudes that promote altruistic behavior towards non-family and even towards non-humans. And some of this can be facilitated by the adoption of certain sorts of norms of reasoning. So a person might grow up in a society where, it's not the case that their society cares a whole lot about animals, but they might also develop norms, attitudes, and dispositions to care a whole lot about things like logical consistency, or to care about grounding their sort of practical applied moral standards in terms of an overarching normative moral framework. And then that person might be persuaded to adopt utilitarianism. And then on reflecting on utilitarianism, come to think, okay, well, if all suffering matters, the suffering of non-human animals doesn't matter any less than the suffering of humans. And so I should care about the suffering of animals. And then they might adjust their behavior accordingly. They might think, okay, maybe I should be vegan. Maybe I should, try to prevent wild animal suffering. And so people can and do reason and think and learn. And this reasoning, thinking, and learning, and the processes involved in this, some of these are going to be personal experiences. Some of this is going to be cultural standards and norms that one internalizes from the surrounding culture. All of these processes can allow people to adopt moral standards that they wouldn't adopt under a wide range of counterfactual circumstances. In other words, their particular moral standards are not, quote unquote, hardwired to where it doesn't matter what range of plausible, ordinary human environments you put them in, they're all going to grow up to have the same moral values. No, instead, they get their moral values from their culture, at least to a significant extent. And so, as long as people have evolved to have these like learning faculties and enculturation faculties, they can have quite expansive altruistic behavioral repertoires without this somehow becoming unmoored from what is fundamentally a set of traits that were selected for and shaped by natural selection, and that is, part of their cognitive architecture. The too long didn't read version of this is that what he's saying here, I think, is wrong, and that humans could have evolved simply to be cultural creatures that pick up norms and standards from their culture, and they could pick up norms and standards that promote acting altruistically towards non-kin. And there's no particularly good reason to think that evolution didn't do that. In fact, I could just say that's what I think evolution did do. So yeah, I don't see a good argument here.
A different biological mechanism. Humans tend to prefer sugary and fatty foods compared to other foods. And one of the reasons for that is because these foods are very rich in calories. And because we can store calories in the form of fat, preferring these sorts of sugary and fatty foods actually would have given us a very good survival advantage in the distant past. Because by eating and preferring these foods, it would give you the excess calories you need to store as fat, which you could then utilize later on when food is scarce. So there's a very good evolutionary explanation for why we prefer these sorts of foods. However, in our modern world, our desire for sugary and fatty foods can often be quite detrimental, mainly because consuming too many of them can lead to things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, atherosclerosis, and numerous other health issues. And so what we see here is that we have a biological inclination to eat certain foods. And while that inclination might have helped us in the distant past to survive, well, it seems to have outlived its usefulness today.
Yeah, so this is an idea that comes out of evolutionary psychology. It's like evolutionary mismatch hypothesis. So the idea would be that we evolved to have a preference for certain sorts of things in the past. There hasn't been a whole lot of selective pressure, enough time for selective pressure to have caught up to modern environments where there's massive food abundance available. I mean, it's only been a century or two. For some places, it's been a few decades where there isn't food scarcity. Food scarcity was still a significant possibility even in the 1800s. So there just hasn't been enough time for the absence of food scarcity, for general, food abundance to have selected for changes in our food preferences. And it could very well be that if we lived somewhere like the United States, more or less with the current economy and dietary habits, that over time people that are better at processing, like people that are more likely to have different food preferences or have much stronger metabolisms that allow them to metabolize a lot more stuff, like they burn more calories or something. There's a lot of potential things that could happen that could be advantageous in our current environment that weren't in the past, but there just hasn't been enough time. So there's a mismatch between our behavioral disposition and what's actually in our sort of reproductive interests, because being super unhealthy isn't going to contribute to your reproductive fitness if you are like more likely to have heart disease or diabetes or something like that. That would be the idea. How does this apply, or how does this analogize to the morality case? I guess we'll see.
And the same could very easily be said about our moral values if they were simply derived from our evolutionary history. If we developed these things when we lived in small tribes as a way of basically increasing our fitness, it would indicate that basically, well, our moral intuitions don't really have any bearing on how we are today. In short, even if we evolved biological intuitions...
Yeah, so in the case of the taste preferences, it could be that the taste preferences are relatively rigidly functional. So in other words, okay, so we are especially disposed towards liking things that have high calorie content, certain kinds of nutrient content, things that are going to be less dangerous. You're going to be disgusted by like rotting and smelly things. So Okay, so we have these like taste capacities, just like vision and hearing. We have these sensory faculties that enhance our reproductive fitness by causing us to eat things that are going to give us calories and drive us forward, and to avoid things that won't do that. Okay, so then we hit the modern environment. We have an abundance of food. We have this capacity like eat the sugary things, eat the fatty things, and now there's so much of it that it's actually counterproductive for many of us. Okay, that would be the idea there. Okay, in the case of morality, the idea would be something like we evolved to promote the reproductive fitness of our kin. So we act in the interest of the people around us. They happen to be related to us because those are the kinds of groups we evolved over millions of years to live in. And so this was adaptive in our ancestral environments. We're no longer in those ancestral environments. And so the behavior is that kind of behavior would no longer be adaptive. Is that the idea? Because I think the idea would instead have to be, and maybe this is what he's getting at, is that we don't act that way. We don't act like only our kin matter. We actually act in a way that's altruistic towards people that are not our kin. In fact, we even act altruistically for many people towards non-human animals. And so how would you explain that? Well, if we're positing that our ancestors would be predisposed to only be concerned with family members, then you can't account for this by that sort of explanation. The problem is that people that think that morality evolved or that human cognitive faculties are a product of natural selection don't have to think that the specific mechanism by which a capacity for moral judgment and reasoning evolved was specifically through this sort of rigid locking in of an altruistic tendency to favor exclusively one's family members and not non-family members or non-human animals. Again, it could be that we evolved a capacity for cultural learning, and that is what has equipped us with thinking in the modern world in a way that allows us to be altruistic towards people outside our kin groups and non-human animals. So if we evolve that capacity, then boom, there is a way in which evolution has influenced our current capacities for moral thinking and reasoning and judgment.
Certain things are moral, that wouldn't actually make them moral. It wouldn't tell us whether we should actually act on those intuitions, because at the end of the day, our biology only dictates what's beneficial for survival and reproduction. There's, of course, tons of other issues with the idea that...
Yeah, I think he could stress that point more, that if natural selection shaped any specific set of moral predispositions, like an opposition to incest or something like that, that wouldn't by itself make it a good idea to think that the thing in question is wrong. It wouldn't like justify that, because just because we're predisposed to think a particular thing is morally good or bad wouldn't entail that it is good or bad. You know, this is, well, I don't need to give analogies. That point is simple enough, but I feel like that would be a better objection to raise than to characterize this rather weird view about the evolution of morality. I don't know how many people really endorse that. And it still seems under-described. Like, what exactly evolved? What specific mechanisms? Like, it's unclear what exactly is supposed to have evolved. Is it that specific normative moral theories evolved, like people evolved to be deontological or utilitarian? Is it that specific moral positions evolve, like we evolved to hold specific moral stances on applied moral issues? Is it thinking in moral terms in a more general sense, regardless of the content? What exactly evolved? This is very under-described, and I don't know what to do with this. It all seems very kind of superficial and underdeveloped. All right. Carlos says, Primer actually made an interesting simulator on altruism and benefits in social groups outside your family to be altruistic so that other group treats you in kind rather than badly. Yeah, you know, there are proposals like reciprocal altruism, and that can happen at the individual level. Potentially, it could also happen at the group level. Is it beneficial? Let's say you live on an island with your family group, and there's 5 or 6 other family groups there, and y'all move around the island, and you may or may not tend to stick to particular regions, and maybe some of them have more access to fresh water, or, you know, higher ground if there's a flood or something like that. Now, if you make pacts and deals and compacts and treaties with the surrounding groups, where, hey, if we're running low on water, can you give us some water? And then if you need high ground, we'll give you some high ground in case of a flood. Those sorts of treaties and deals can work out in everybody's mutual benefit. People do this all the time. This is what trade is. This is why trade is useful. Something that has less relative value to me than it does to you is something that, you know, it's worth 10 units to me, but 50 to you, and something worth only 10 units to you because of, you know, diminishing marginal returns or something, but it's worth 50 to me. We both benefit from trading. So it's not like evolution couldn't account for people behaving altruistically towards non-kin in the first place. I had given one example earlier, but yeah, you're right. This in which this could occur. What I'm saying though is simply that there's no particularly good reason to think that any particular more narrow or localized behavioral predisposition has to be a direct product of natural selection. Like we have a little module in the brain saying, think that this particular thing is wrong or think about morality in this particular way. Rather, we could have fairly general systems for acquiring norms and growing up and learning from the culture and society around us. And really, it could just be, and this is, again, I keep saying this as if it's hypothetical. I think that humans evolved and are selective, like our particular evolutionary niche is the cultural organism. We are culture sponges. And what makes us really good at surviving and reproducing isn't that we have some rigid set of moral dispositions that we're inclined to act upon, or that we have any other particular behavioral predispositions that are fairly locked in. Rather, what I think is adaptive about human beings is the ability to not be locked in that way and to instead rely on acquiring one's knowledge of resource extraction and social behavior and the types of institutions that we develop. Our capacity for developing these things isn't hardwired or innate in some very strong sense, but rather is externalized to our cultures. And this allows us to pass things on from one generation to the next in a way that can be modified and adapted in a way that's much faster than what would be available via conventional natural selection. Think about how much a culture or a society could change. They could change in a single generation. Societies and cultures can change sometimes in the span of weeks or months in certain respects, but in the broad span of time, it could even take centuries for larger patterns to develop. For instance, for Christianity or Islam to have spread to different parts of the world. Cultures evolve at a rate that is far faster than genes. And this allowed humans to spread all over the world and to quickly learn to adapt to a wide variety of different sorts of environments. Think about how we operate. We make tools, we learn about our local ecologies, and we learn how to find water, which things are poisonous and which things aren't, what things we can make into functional tools, what sorts of things we can eat, what we can't eat, where we can go, where we can't go. How do you survive in the cold? How do you survive in the heat? How do you survive in a bright sun? How do you survive in the dark? How do you survive in the water? Humans are very, very good relative to many other organisms at adapting to new environments. That adaptation is facilitated through cultural evolution. It's not facilitated through some, set of genes that you're born with. And, researchers like Kim Sterelny and others in his book, The Evolved Apprentice, and other people have written about this sort of thing too. One of the common stories they tell is about some Europeans that were stranded in Australia in the outback. And I believe most of them died. I think maybe one or two of them was eventually rescued by indigenous people there. And the indigenous people there knew exactly how to survive in the local environment. And they knew all sorts of means of like where to get water, how to survive the heat, that sort of thing. But the European settlers had no idea. People don't just know. And, if you put me somewhere in, near the North Pole, I'm not going to know how to survive there. I would die very, very quickly, like in a day, maybe in a few hours. Meanwhile, there's been people that have lived, in very, very northern parts of the world for generation after generation after generation. They pass down that knowledge. That knowledge isn't acquired from their genetics. It's acquired from their culture. So that's what humans are adapted to do. And that, I think, offers a better account of what morality is. Morality is a cultural invention. It's a kind of technology. It's not a part of our biological heritage. All right, let's have a look at the comments. All right. Real Name says, evolutionary debunking arguments make no sense, in my opinion. We evolved to want an incredibly narrow spectrum of things, and acquiring those things is served by hyper-specific moral stances. I don't know why that would mean that evolutionary debunking arguments don't make sense. I do know that Joe Schmid just put out a video over in Majesty of Reason with a couple people on there to talk about evolutionary debunking arguments. So go check out that. So there's specialists and experts on that topic. I have a little bit of work on evolutionary debunking arguments, but not enough that you should listen to me and not to them. So go check out their video. JP says, Lance, in the last video, you said there were no consequences entailed by objective morality, no dog walking rule. But the theist has a clear answer to this, even if you didn't believe it. Thoughts? Well, what are the consequences? Yeah, so I know that was a while ago. That was like 20 minutes ago. But if you know what those consequences are, please tell me about them. Blabbit says, Lance, does the problem of evil work on anti-realism? I don't know what kind of problem of evil, because typically a problem of evil is supposed to be an argument for the non-existence of God. It's supposed to point out some sort of inconsistency, even logical contradiction in there being a God and there being some state of affairs like gratuitous suffering or even suffering at all. So typically it's like, hey, you can't have this and that. I don't know what the issue would be with the problem of evil for anti-realism. That's a good one, Sapir. I'm not going to put that up here, though, about body armor. Dog's Domain says, how does God explain morality? Yeah, good question. So there's going to be a whole lot of theistic explanations. I don't know if it's not like they're going to have an easy time of it. Dog's Domain says, how would God give you deontic ethics? Why would his commands be obligatory? Yeah, good question. I don't know why they would be obligatory. And it would depend on what you mean by obligatory. Dog's Domain says, that's a question you have to ask. How do the commands give you a reason to do a thing? Why are God's commands any more different than anyone else's? Yeah, and there's lots of practical ways in which God's commands would be different. So, for instance, God might be in a better position to know what would be in your long-term interest than you do. It's true, because God's omniscient and you're not. God is in a position to enforce his commands in any way he sees fit at his discretion at any time for any reason instantaneously. So they're maximally enforceable. That's a practically relevant consideration, at least if God isn't somehow barred from holding you accountable. But typically, at least for Christianity, at least the moral rules are very enforceable. That doesn't mean you necessarily go to hell, but it's not like God doesn't do anything if you break his rules. There are consequences. All right. Yeah, Coffee Smug says this video seems utterly unpersuasive to anyone who's not already only God can grant objective morality type theist. Yeah, but lots of videos are going to be very unpersuasive to their critics, so I don't know that that's saying a whole lot. Carlos says, well, I don't think the two are exclusive. I'm in the position that culture has some selective impact. If culture favors certain dispositions, those who naturally have them flourish. Oh, absolutely. So I'm a proponent of what's called gene culture coevolution. So this is the sort of thing that will happen. And there's like relevant types of things that like phenomena that have been proposed, like the Baldwin effect. So here's what can happen. And in fact, this has probably happened in human evolutionary history. So humans change their behavior. Let's say there's a group of people that start milking animals, and some of the people within that population are more capable of metabolizing animal milk. And so they have an extra resource available to them for food. They have a slight advantage over other people. And so over time within that population, people have increasing lactose tolerance. That has happened. So a change in the culture or the behavior causes a change in the selective pressures that changes people's biology. So they work in tandem with one another. So when the culture changes, it changes the selective pressures for members of that culture. So, if literacy is introduced and literacy confers some sort of survival advantage or reproductive advantage for people, and it's plausible that it would. If you're literate, you may be more capable of moving up the social hierarchy within your society. You're more capable of being high status, having greater resources, more likely to have offspring, more likely to live longer, more likely to pay for medical care, more likely to pay for protection. There's a whole bunch of potential advantages you could get from literacy. So now people that are better able to learn to read and write are going to have a selective advantage. And then that changes people's biology. So those people are going to have different brains. There's something about them that's making them better able to learn to read or write. So yeah, I'm not at all suggesting that culture, like basically natural selection created these culture sponge parts of our brains. They got locked in and now they stay that way. No. These are interacting with one another. culture changes, and that changes our biology. The biology changes, then changes our culture, and they are working and constantly in tandem with one another, each mutually influencing the other. All right. Wow, lots more comments. Yeah, JPW says, what are the consequences? Eternal torment after death. Yeah, but that is consistent with anti-realism. So it's not that the realism component is having any sorts of consequences. So, you're pointing to practical consequences. Those aren't consequences of realism as such. So I don't consider that to be a consequence of realism in particular. What you would need to show is that there are specific consequences to not complying with stance independent normative facts, not that if God says, hey, here's the stance independent normative facts and you got to follow them. And if you don't, I'm going to kick your ass. So now the consequence is someone's going to kick your ass. There's always a way to get indirect consequences of something. But those consequences are not entailed by the thing. They're not like part of it.
Morality has a basis in biology, but given my passion for biology, you could probably imagine I'd be able to spend the entire talk just talking about the issues with this theory alone. So I'm going to stop myself right there. If you do want to know some of the other issues with this theory, though, feel free to ask about it during the question period. So if none of these foundations for objective morality work, what else is there to actually explain the reality of objective moral values and duties? Well, what about what I've been suggesting this entire time? If objective moral facts and duties exist, God exists. And it actually makes a lot of sense that objective morality would have its foundation in God the more you think about it. If entire time, if objective moral facts and duties exist,
there's some comments on here, and I want to be sure to read them. And one group of them passed by really quickly.
God exists, and it actually makes.
Let's have a look at this. I should note, only if one believes that morality is objective would you have to conclude that God exists. You could conclude God doesn't exist, but you would also have to acknowledge that morality is an objective. Yeah, okay.
A lot of sense of objective moral values and duties. Well, what about what I've been suggesting this entire time? If objective moral facts and duties exist, God exists. And it actually makes a lot of sense that objective morality would have its foundation in God the more you think about it. If morality is objective, it means that certain things would be immoral or moral no matter what we think. Basically, even if people in the past thought certain immoral behaviors like infanticide and exploitation were okay, that doesn't actually make them okay. Those things were still wrong even when people were mistaken about them, much like how an entire classroom could very feasibly get a math problem wrong, but that wouldn't actually change the answer of that math problem. So we see here that morality is objective. But additionally, because we can know what is moral through rational means, we can rationally determine whether or not something is moral or immoral.
When did he establish that?
Because morality is all about interpersonal interactions, that seems to indicate that whatever the foundation for morality is, it must be rational and capable of interpersonal interactions, meaning it would therefore be sentient.
How does that? Where did he get that from? Where is that coming from? What is this based on? This is baffling. I don't even know what to say about that.
Moral facts and duties.
He's not explaining why this follows or what the reasoning behind this is. This is very strange.
Therefore, must be grounded in a necessary, unchanging, transcendent, sentient.
Why must it be?
Source. And that source is what we would call God. Because those traits are what we've always ascribed.
I mean, this is just an assertion. I'm not seeing any clear argument for this at all. There's a kind of implied argument here, like like moral standards are personal, so their source has to be personal. But what is is there some principle of reasoning that follows? It's really weird.
To God. It makes a lot of sense given what Stephen talked about earlier regarding the cosmological argument, because there we realized we need some sort of necessary unchanging being for the universe to exist. And therefore, we would have very good grounds to ground morality in that same necessary unchanging being. The conclusion of the moral argument also very naturally follows given what I discussed earlier with the teleological argument. Because if God fine-tuned the universe for life, that seems to imply he is sentient and has an affinity for life.
What is the argument for that? It seems to imply it. It doesn't seem that way to me. What is he talking about? Where is this coming from?
So we have very good reason to ground morality, something that only applies to living things, in that same sentient, life-loving, necessary being that was implied to exist by the teleological argument. And so given all of this, given that the cosmological argument and teleological argument kind of naturally lead into the moral argument, it's pretty safe to say that if objective morals exist, if good and evil actually exist, God exists. Now, I do want to finish this talk by clearing up some misconceptions about this argument, because there are a few that people often bring. The first thing I want to clarify is this. My argument is not that only theists can be moral, nor am I saying that theists, or those who believe in God, are better than atheists. Atheists can be moral, and in fact, there's probably plenty of atheists who are more moral than many Christians, which is frankly something we should be ashamed about, but still. At the same time, my argument isn't that God exists because Christians are better than atheists or more moral than atheists. That is not my argument. My argument is that without God, you can't justify where the standard for objective morality actually comes from. My argument is that atheism can't provide a foundation for an objective standard of morality, whereas theism can.
Yeah, he hasn't shown that. And I don't even think it can. I don't think atheism can provide a foundation for objective morality, because I don't think anyone can provide a foundation for objective morality. Christians, theists, atheists, anybody. But what he's done is entertained a few vague, underdeveloped, weak considerations, and then responded to those. I could do that I could present like, hey, here's 3 dumb things Christians say, so we should reject Christianity. That would be a good reason for rejecting Christianity. What about Humer's account? What about Enoch's account? Like, again, I don't want to play defense for the side that I spend all my time rejecting, but if we're going to reject realism, I mean, I don't mind doing it. If we're going to reject secular forms of realism, we should be rejecting them for good reasons. And I don't think he's given us good reasons to do so. I think he's given us some incredibly weak, vague, underdeveloped things that atheists might say in defense of moral realism. The last of these, I don't even think they would say, for the most part. And then because he shot these down, we got to have God or something. This is very weak as an argument. Like, if the approach here is a process of elimination approach, he hasn't even eliminated any of the main contenders for a secular moral realism, like none of them. What about all the naturalist realist accounts? What about Sturgeon, Boyd, Railton? Did he present any objections to any of their views? Nope. Did he present an objection to Humer's views? Did he present an objection to Enoch's views? Cuneo, Case, Samson, who else? Schaefer Landau. I haven't seen any objections to any of their arguments here. This is as far as objections to secular moral realism goes, he didn't do a good job here. This is really disappointing, and that's unfortunate.
Atheists can still do good things, and they can still be good in general. They just can't justify why good and evil actually exist. Another objection I sometimes hear when people use this argument is, quote unquote, hey, I don't need the Bible to know what's right and wrong. Or as some people might put it, you don't need religion to have morals. If you can't determine right from wrong, then you lack empathy, not religion. And the thing is, this is also misunderstanding the argument I'm making. And that should probably be very clear to all of you, because I didn't quote the Bible once to make my point. You see, I'm not claiming that you need to read the Bible or that you need to believe in God to know that there is a right and wrong, or to do that which is right and avoid that which is wrong. At the end of the day, the moral argument doesn't talk about how we know what is moral. That's why I said the evolutionary argument could actually still work with the moral argument, because even if we developed our moral intuitions via evolution, that tells us nothing about whether our moral intuitions are actually right. You see, I'm not talking about how we know what is right and wrong. I'm talking about the very nature of morality itself. The fact that there actually is a good and evil to speak of. You can know what is right and wrong without appealing to God, in the same way that I can know that 2 + 2 = 4 without actually appealing to a mathematical proof for that. But in both of these cases, you need an actual foundation to show that these things are true. And that's where God comes into the picture when it comes to morality. Actually, Stephen summarized this argument in the best way I've heard when he originally asked me to give a presentation on this argument. His very basic and provocative summary of the argument is this: God exists because evil exists. You can know that good and evil exist without believing in God. Yes, that is true. However, good and evil can't exist if God doesn't exist. I actually really love the way you phrased that, because I was reflecting on this argument a while back, and I realized, like, when I look back on my story as a Christian, I think that God exists was actually based on the existence of evil. I effectively deduced, like, okay, if evil actually exists, God needs to exist. Mind you, I of course formulated that argument over a decade ago, so it wasn't nearly as robust and complex as the argument I gave today, but I was 13 at the time, cut me some slack. Now, like with all my talks, there's of course a lot I didn't get to cover, including a section on Euthyphro's dilemma, but if you want to hear more, please feel free to ask about that stuff during the question period. Additionally, if you want more resources on this argument, I cannot recommend enough Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis.
Ugh.
This book basically spends the first 30 pages or so just on the moral argument, and he explains it in a way that I've never heard before, so it's worth the read if you want more.
Yeah, I mean, the only things I've ever seen from C.S. Lewis on metaethics were terrible. They were completely unconvincing. All right, that's it for that video. Let's have a look at the chat. So yeah, go check out his channel. Leave some nice comments over there. I really don't want people to be mean to people that I critique. I didn't find that very convincing. I think he could have done a better job there. I hope he engages with Secular Council Moral Realism more directly in the future. And I don't see any reason to think he's not capable of doing that. But a lot of those objections seemed pretty weak to me. All right, a few random things. Yeah, so Mason says a lot of jumping to conclusions here. Yeah, it seems like there's something missing from that particular argument that like, hey, you know, that like moral facts somehow imply that there's a lawgiver or some source that has to be personal. I don't know why, and we're not told why. Maybe he gave some other talk about teleology or something that would flesh that out a bit more, but I'm not seeing it in this talk. Let's see what else. Someone with FFFFF just says, are you a theist or atheist or something else? You're asking me. I'm an atheist. Sorry, I don't know why I'm suddenly choking up when I say that. I'm an atheist. Yeah, I don't believe in gods. I think gods don't exist. So yeah, like standard type of atheist that believes gods don't exist. Although I do frequently defend the view that I actually think a good way of drawing the distinction between theism and atheism is to say theists are people that believe in God, atheists are everybody else. So anybody that doesn't believe in God is an atheist. I like that framework because it's mutually exhaustive, the two terms. And so everybody is either one or the other. And then people could pick their positions within that. So someone could say I'm an atheist agnostic or whatever. I know that in the philosophical literature, for whatever reason, atheism has been used to refer to a sort of positive disbelief in God. I don't like that terminology. I think it's worse. And I will argue with anybody about this, theists, atheists. This is a practical question. We get to decide what our words mean, and we should choose to use the word atheist to be inclusive of like lack theists, people that lack belief. So that's how I prefer the terminology. And I'm right about this. And if you disagree, you're wrong. And that's a brute fact. Let's look. JPW said, Lance's reaction to the C.S. Lewis plug is one of the funniest things I've seen on YouTube this year. Yeah, it's just everything about C.S. Lewis has always just struck me as like an attempt at being profound or thoughtful or philosophical, but it all just strikes me as very amateurish and underdeveloped and weak and poorly argued. I've never seen anything remotely persuasive from C.S. Lewis for anything philosophical. It's always just struck me as like, let me tell you a story, or let me give you an allegory, or let me say this clever sounding thing. None of it has any substance to it. He seems like a very, very porous philosopher as far as philosophy goes. His views just seem very weak, and you could fly a jet through the holes in what's just not there. There's just nothing there. I don't know what people are impressed with him for. He did do that whole Chronicles of Narnia thing, right? Like I like the first couple of the movies. I'll give him credit for that. I don't care if it's Christian allegory. I liked it. Seabass says, what normative theory do you hold to? Are you asking me? If you're asking questions to me, that's great. So at me, though, because I don't know if you're talking to each other or you're talking to me. I'll assume you're talking to me, though. I don't have any normative theory. I used to be a utilitarian. I was a utilitarian for a very long time. I was a total hedonic act utilitarian. So I thought the thing that we should do is maximize happiness, minimize suffering. Like basically a classical utilitarian, like Bentham. So I was a utilitarian for a long time. I don't know, I didn't catalog this. I wasn't journaling or something. So I don't know when I stopped being a utilitarian, but I just stopped being one at some point. And I no longer endorse normative moral theories. In fact, you could call me a normative quietist. I deny that there is even anything meaningful to do when it comes to normative moral theories. I think that the whole enterprise is just totally a waste of time. All right. Yeah, Carlos asked me about deists. Yeah, I consider them theists. Yeah, Nero says, I think Galactius definition is better for sociological categorization, even if people prefer the other definition for philosophical debates. Yeah, I would prefer it for both, I guess. People could come up with some new term for positive disbelief in God. Yeah, Scott says, not very clear to it. Sorry, it's not very clear to me that the analogy with math works in the video. Does math really have a foundation? It seems like there's far from universal agreement on what that would even be. Well, yeah, I'm not a mathematical Platonist, and I don't, I see math as a construction or invention by humans. I see math very much like the rules of Monopoly. It's something that we created, and certain mathematical systems have turned out to be more useful than others, and so we've kept them and we use them. And so they're true in a pragmatic sense, but there's not any deep metaphysics behind them. Retrovo says the Screw Tape Letters is one of the most juvenile things I've ever read. That wasn't meant for children. Yeah, I mean, this is my attitude with like my reaction. Everything I've seen from Lewis, it seems like that something like if you told some contemporary Christian that runs one of those churches, hey, one second. Okay, I couldn't come up with a good example, but there, these like modern churches where the person wears skinny jeans and like maybe brings a guitar and tries to be cool, and like they post their like, hey, we're gonna have a sermon on like Facebook or something, and they always have lame names. I feel like if you told one of those people they had to write a book about Christianity, like it would sound like C.S. Lewis. Like it doesn't sound like something like a scholar would write. It doesn't sound like something someone with full of wisdom would write. It sounds like what someone would write if that person wasn't very wise and wasn't very thoughtful. It all sounds very performative. I really don't like it. It just sounds, ugh. There's something about it just comes off as, ugh. I don't know what else to say. I mean, if someone disagrees and they love C.S. Lewis, they're welcome to come on my channel and read some C.S. Lewis passages to me. And maybe that's something I could do. I could get C.S. Lewis passages and read them and react to them. All right. Sapir says, Lance, would you mind clarifying what you take normative theories to be trying to do and why that goes wrong? Yeah, so normative ethics. So you have the three areas of ethics. You have meta ethics is the most abstract, then you have normative ethics in the middle, and then you have applied ethics. So meta ethics is addressing the abstract and fundamental questions about the nature of morality. So, what is morality? Can we have moral knowledge? Are there objective moral truths or not? What do we mean when we make moral claims? So it's like super interdisciplinary. So it spans metaphysics, epistemology, philosophy of language, philosophy of science, all sorts of areas, but it's dealing with those abstract questions. So then you have applied ethics down at the bottom. I'm not putting them in order of importance. I'm putting them in there's like hierarchy. You could flip it if you want. I don't care. You could say meta ethics is at the bottom and applied ethics is at the top. Doesn't matter. Applied ethics is dealing with the application of normative moral principles to specific cases like abortion or euthanasia. And then you got normative ethics in the middle. So normative ethics is, we're setting aside the meta-ethical questions, although some people think that meta-ethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics aren't fully independent of one another. They interact and are entangled into one another in various ways. Maybe that's true. But with normative ethics, you're trying to come up with the correct set of foundational moral principles that govern right and wrong action. And so the standard ones would be like utilitarianism, which says right and wrong action is determined by what maximizes utility. You have deontology that says the locus of moral judgment is in principles, rules, and right and wrong conduct. It's not determined by appeal to the consequences or the expected consequences of actions, but the nature of the actions themselves. And then you have virtue ethics that says that right and wrong action ultimately turns on what kind of character traits that you possess. There's virtues and vices, and it's all about the cultivation of virtues. So those are your sort of three standard normative moral philosophies, at least within Western philosophy. There's other things that fall kind of outside the scope of that. And there's like hybrid positions where you mix aspects of these. So there's your normative ethics. So what are people trying to do in these cases? So if I'm an anti-realist, I act with respect to my goals, standards, and values. At least for me, not all anti-realists are going to be like me. They could be some kind of constructivist. They could be an ideal observer theorist or something like that. But for me, I just act based on my values. And so when I reflect on my values, I may find that my values are most closely in line with utilitarianism or deontology or virtue ethics or something like that. Like that may or may not be the case, but when they're not, they're not. And so what would I be trying to do in like trying to figure out like whether utilitarianism is correct or deontology is correct? Like, what am I doing? Am I trying to find out something about my revealed psychology? Like, am I trying to figure out if on reflection I'm a deontologist or utilitarian? Or am I trying to find out like which theory is the correct theory? Like, what the hell are they even doing? Because if it's about figuring out like what the correct moral theory is, I have no interest in doing that because I don't think there is a correct one. Like independent of my own values. If I'm trying to engage in this sort of psychological exercise of uncovering my values, well, it doesn't comport with any of those, and I already know that. So, what am I supposed to be doing? Yeah, it seems very weird to me. The people doing this seem to think that like you could figure out whether you should be a deontologist or utilitarian. What exactly are they figuring out? The whole thing seems very weird to me. And however many Fs. I hope that addresses your question too. It's the same question. You ask, why do you think normative moral theory is a waste of time? And that view is called moral quietist. Yeah, I guess I call myself a quietist about normative ethics. Dog's Domain says normative theories just try to generalize moral intuitions to come up with deontic rules to explain why individual people or actions are good or bad and what is obligatory and what isn't. Yeah, well, I don't even think moral intuitions are a real phenomenon. So, like, why would I be involved in this if that's what people were doing? I don't think that's the only way to construe normative ethics. But as far as that's what it is, then yeah, I'm not doing that. Nero says, I think his quietism is mainly about meta ethics, not normative ethics. Oh, I don't know if you were here earlier, but I said I was a quietist about normative ethics too. JPW says, fantastic. We got 3 C.S. Lewis in one stream. Yeah, just not impressed. Not impressed. Yeah, are there other Christians I should be impressed with? Because it's not C.S. Lewis. Yeah, AA says something similar to what I was saying earlier. I just take normative theorizing to be a descriptive psychology product trying to capture or verbalize what maps onto your psychology. This flows from my anti-realism. Yeah, I don't think that anything principled comes out of it. Ethics make more sense from a realist point of view. Yeah, probably. But it's not like normative ethics like doesn't or can't make sense as for an anti-realist. They could certainly do normative ethics. I don't think they have any barrier at all to doing that. They're not pursuing what the stance independently correct normative moral theory is. They're doing some kind of psychology or something. It's just that I don't have any particular reason to think my psychology is going to map onto a particular normative moral theory. Among other things, is why would my normative moral standards? So someone might think something like this. They might think, well, even if you're an anti-realist, you still have a implicit set of moral principles governing your moral judgments. And so when you go out in the world making judgments in applied moral cases, you make a judgment about abortion, you make a judgment about euthanasia, you make a judgment about what the tax policy should be, you make a judgment about in what case it's okay to lie or not. Okay, so underwriting that, maybe you're a deontologist, maybe you're a utilitarian, and you got to figure it out. And then you go through this whole like process of reflective equilibrium, and you talk to other philosophers, and then you figure out, are you really committed to utilitarianism or deontology or what is some other theory? And you figure it out. But I don't see any good reason, psychologically speaking, to think that I have a stable, principled set of implicit commitments to one or another competing normative moral theories. Why would I? Why would I have to have that underneath it all? Why would I even think it's especially likely that I do? This idea of normative theorizing, where people are appealing to their intuitions to like get at the correct, normative moral theory. I think this is a largely constructive process where people adopt norms and standards that are distinctive to academic philosophy, and then they're engaged in a kind of pseudo introspective process when what they're really doing is a kind of constructive process that they are sort of bandying about and bouncing around different considerations and theories. they're not really uncovering what's part of their underlying implicit. It's not like, okay, let me give an analogy. Let's say that there was like a fossilized remains buried under the ground, and you're like an archaeologist or whatever, or a paleontologist, whatever the correct discipline is. I always get them mixed up. And okay, so this is all the dirt over the bones, and you're digging away the bones, and it reveals the skeleton underneath. I think a lot of people doing normative moral theorizing are theorizing in that sort of way, even if they're an anti-realist. You see, because what they're trying to do is uncover the bones of their own moral psychology. Even if it's not stance independently true, there's a presumption that, like, imagine if I said there's 3 skeleton types. There's A, B, or C that you could have behind your moral thinking and your moral judgments. And then they uncover and they're like, it's type B, that's what I really am. Or it's type C, that's what I really am. That's what it seems like anti-realists can take themselves to be doing if they're engaged in normative moral theorizing. But why think that there's these cluster patterns implicit in one's moral judgments that comport with one or another of these sort of discrete, principled systems that are implicit? I don't think things are that implicit. So read something like, Nick Chater's The Mind is Flat. I think that our moral judgments are flexible, they change, they are context dependent. I don't think there is any shared, unified, underlying normative principles driving my moral judgments. I don't think they're unified around some deeper set of principles. I think that there's no depth there. And I think that this is generally true for other people's psychology. And so part of the reason I think that people normative moral theorizing remains so intractable, and why people are so incorrigible, and why nobody ever agrees on anything, is because I think they're all digging for bones, and there's no bones. It's all sand. Everything is on the surface. The mind is flat. And I think that this is true for moral judgments. I don't think people really have deep implicit commitments to one or another of competing moral theories. I think what they have are vibes, and those vibes change based on circumstance and their attitude and their disposition and the time of day. And there are certainly going to be personality characteristics that people have, and certain things that they commit themselves to, and certain sorts of extraneous beliefs that are going to dispositionally incline some people more towards utilitarianism or deontology or whatever. And so those people are, to a certain extent, they've got skeletons, but I don't think those skeletons are discovered so much as typically in most cases constructed. People are building casts and then thinking that they dug them up, if the metaphor makes sense. I don't know how much I'm straining the metaphor. But I think that a great deal of analytic philosophy is a constructed process that people then mistake for being a process of discovery. So I think that analytic philosophers are, in a way, kind of doing a very weird type of, how do I want to put it? I think a lot of them take themselves to be engaged in this process of figuring out how they were using terms all along, when instead what's happening is that they are engaged with a very small group of people, this little insular community, and they are buffeted by the winds of whatever papers they happen to read, and people they happen to talk to, and conversations they happen to have, and thoughts that they happen to have. All of that buffets them around until they settle on a particular position that they mistakenly take to have been the implicit position they held all along, when really they're just, a leaf on the wind, landing here or landing there, and mistakenly taken where they land to have been their destination. And basically, I think that philosophers are unaware of just how, to put it bluntly, fucked their presumptions about human psychology are. I think they're just fundamentally wrong about how language works, how meaning works, how human psychology works, about what their methods are, how their methods actually work, what they're actually doing when they employ those methods. And I think that the consequence of that is that philosophers are engaged in a catastrophically wasteful process of philosophical inquiry that doesn't get them anywhere. They're not making discoveries; they're constructing pseudo discoveries, and that this is a very, very serious problem for the field. I think the field is not working. I think it's in a very poor state. Philosophers like to scoff at people that herald the death of philosophy. I'm not saying it's going to die and go away. That's a question for institutions and departments in society. It's not a question for whether the field is going to persist. I think philosophers are extremely dogmatic in many cases and extremely persistent, and they love their word games, and they're not going to give them up. Pointing out that Wittgenstein was right, and that most of these issues are pseudo problems, and that many philosophers are wasting their time doing what amounts to fancy Sudoku that's not going to get them to stop doing it. And it's not going to get people to stop funding them to do it. And it's not going to make philosophy steer towards the right path. It's been around for thousands of years. I don't see it going away that soon. And I also don't know if it would be good to try to it's bad, we got to get rid of it. No, I don't want to get rid of it. I want it to change and be better. And I want people to start caring about how psychology influences how you go about thinking about these sorts of things, and how ungrounded philosophy has become since the linguistic turn, or maybe even before that too. How philosophers are floating around on this or that cloud, and they're not coming down to earth, and they're not remaining integrated with the sciences. And the sciences have made so much progress. They've made so many strides. And the antagonism that one often sees between philosophers towards the sciences, like they just don't want to get their hands dirty and don't want to do empirical work, and the sort of reciprocal antagonism from scientists who are dismissive of philosophy and view it as irrelevant and pretentious and a big waste of time. There's some truth on both sides, but rather than getting over their respective resentments towards one another and working together, they often work separately. And that's not to say that there isn't interdisciplinary work. You have experimental philosophy, you have cognitive scientists that work in both areas. And that's the stuff I frequently consider the good stuff. Some of the best work, I think, is work that traverses both fields, work like Dan Dennett's. And then what do philosophers do when they encounter work like Dennett's? Well, a lot of philosophers respect Dennett, but a lot of people, even if they liked Dennett or liked some of his work, there's a fair number of people that have nothing but sneering contempt for his views about consciousness. And I find that really unfortunate. And I think it really sucks. And I don't like that at all. All right. Doug's Domain, what do you think of the minimal facts argument for Jesus? You'd have to remind me of exactly what it was. I was just looking at a video on the minimal facts maybe a couple months ago. I don't find any of these arguments very good, though. Yeah, I remember listening to that and going, "Oh, this is not even remotely persuasive," but I'd have to review it in real time. It's not the sort of thing I've internalized. Yeah. Looking through the comments, I see Sapir thanking me for clarifying my view of normative ethics. Seabass, I don't really have a view on that, and it's a bit outside the scope of the kinds of stuff that I typically talk about here, but thanks for the questions. I see. Yeah. Moxie says, could there be a pragmatic argument for normative ethics? I mean, there could be a pragmatic argument for just about anything. Pragmatism is a pretty big damn tent. I would hope that views I really, really don't like, one couldn't give a pragmatic rationale for them, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to turn out to be the case. I see what you're saying, though. Samaxi says, could there be a pragmatic argument for normative ethics, like having a consistent and intuitive framework improves our ability to make decisions or advocate for our views or something like that? Yeah, maybe, but that would be doing something quite a bit different than what people take themselves to be doing in normative ethics typically. Siva says, if you think that our judgments or intuitions aren't following certain patterns, do you think we should be consistent when it comes to ethics? Not necessarily. I don't know. I mean, it would depend on the particular consistency or inconsistency you're talking about. Like, you'd have to give a specific example. And then I'd largely just be telling you, well, I care about consistency, so I'd be in favor of consistency, but I don't think there's like an objective fact that you ought to be consistent or not. All right. Any more questions or comments for me? Otherwise, I'm going to wrap it up there. Give people a couple minutes. That's it. Okay, everybody. Not going to wait any longer. I'm already tired too. All right, everybody. Thanks everybody for being here. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, leave a comment in the comment section, do all that stuff. Also, do check out the link in the description for this video, or the links, really. I linked to the video I just reviewed. And then I also have a link to my link tree, which will take you to my blog, to my Discord community, to my academic site. You could go to all those things. So check all that stuff out. And yeah, I'm done. I'm tired. I think you could tell I'm slowing down here. So have a good night, everybody. Take care.